Just before we start and everyone introduces themselves, I just want to give a high five to Business for the Arts for holding this event. We're going to hopefully help tee up the brainstorm this afternoon, but I'm really excited about it because anytime there's some friction in the world that you want to try to remove or reduce, it's often those people who maybe don't yet have the ability to rely on a checkbook who look for more creative and innovative solutions to reducing that friction. And that's these people in the room. That's what Business for the Arts understands. I guarantee you that, in recognizing Melanie Joly a few years ago, I bet Nicole Anderson is the least surprised person in this room that she's now our Minister of Heritage. That's what Business for the Arts does. Big kudos, big high five. So let's get to our panel. Rather than listen to me boringly read off their bios, I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves. And I'm going to ask you to just hide your Canadian passport for a minute, and I want you to totally just brag about yourself for 30 seconds. Tell us about who you are. Tell us about your contribution in the arts, and please lay it on thick. We want to hear it. Mo, let's start with you.
There's always a danger in going first. But the reason I'm here today is, we'll start with the bragging. I won the Arnold Edinborough Award 3 years ago. And maybe we'll just back up from there. The reason I won that award was 10 years prior to that, I had started a dance festival based on a North Indian folk music and dance form called Bhangra. And the reason I had started that in Vancouver when I did was actually as a bit of an escape from my professional life in the realm of technology, working as a software developer and database architect. And I was looking for meaning and belonging and all sorts of things in my own life and not having any sort of escape. I decided to start a dance festival. And that was just kind of, begun on instinct almost. And as happens with the arts, it was a slippery slope. So many, many years later, I now find myself on the board of the Vancouver Opera, the Vancouver International Jazz Festival. I've worked with a number of organizations in both board governance and advocacy capacities and working on not only supporting the art scene in Vancouver, but also in bridging communities and culture across discipline and genre and sectors through arts and culture.
Thanks, Mo. Irfhan.
That's tough to follow. My name is Irfhan Rawji. I've been involved with a number of things in the arts. In Toronto, when I lived in Toronto, I was involved with the Harbourfront Centre as well as Business for the Arts. I'm on the board of an organization called the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, which is that organization that gives out the cultural access pass that was talked about in the last panel. By the way, we've had 140,000 people sign up for that, which has been fantastic, and open access to 1,200 places and spaces in Canada for new citizens of Canada. Right now I'm involved with an organization called the Glenbow Museum, which is a large art gallery in Calgary, the largest art gallery actually in Western Canada, as well as a couple smaller projects that I'm spending some time on in Ontario, one of which is the Blythe Festival, which is doing a large capital project that we're trying to turn into a social enterprise. So a number of different projects in the arts.
Thanks. Charles, en français, si tu préfères.
Oui, tout à fait. Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Ça fait plaisir d'être ici. Mon nom est Charles Milliard. I'm a pharmacist. I work at Uniprix, which is the second biggest chain drugstores in Quebec with 400 stores. I'm executive vice president. I guess I'm the only pharmacist in here, which is a problem to me. I guess health professionals are not involved enough in the arts, so maybe we can talk a little bit about that. The main reason I'm here, actually, I'm the vice chairman of the Festival TransAmériques, which is a beautiful, amazing theater and contemporary dance festival in Quebec. It's been existing for 30 years now. We like to say we're the biggest and the most well-known theater and dance festival in Canada. I usually say that to a Quebec audience, but I dare say that to a Canadian audience as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Anne?
Hi, everyone. My name is Anne Maggissano. I'm Vice President of Burgundy Asset Management, which is an investment firm based out of Toronto. The reason I'm here today is when I made the decision to go into investment, I actually have an arts background. I studied art and I studied film studies at the University of Toronto. And that transition from studying art and being so immersed in this very rich world of ideas, I really didn't want to lose any connection to that when I was making that transition into the investment world. So I decided to get engaged in the arts, and I started very small. I started becoming a member of AGO Next, and there's a representative here from AGO Next, Rita Stewart, who's the chair of that program. I started getting involved with Business for the Arts and through their ambassador program, CanStage, and the Canadian Opera Company. And through my involvement with the Canadian Opera Company, and specifically as co-chair of a large party for young people, which is called Opera Nation, I gradually became a member of the board of the Canadian Opera Company, and so that's why I'm here today.
Thanks. And Jan-Fryderyk?
Bonjour, Jan-Fryderyk Pleszcynski. Je suis un entrepreneur dans le numérique qui pilote une compagnie avec mon associé, une compagnie d'une centaine d'employés dans le Myland, à Montréal, dans les effets visuels, l'animation, le jeu vidéo, la publicité. If you look at we do that in Montreal. We say we were going to do it in French and then we switch back and forth. On my Twitter profile, I think that the first line is husband of one, father of two, and then the rest, right? And then when you think that you are putting together the fact that you are co-owning a business and that it's family first, then it's supposed to be no time, or is there any time left? Well, for me, and that's what I was saying a couple of weeks back in Toronto, because I was delighted enough to be the Arnold Edinborough winner this year. Thanks again to Business for the Arts. In my no time, I thought that it was not a plus to give back, but it was a must. So it's always been part of the DNA and part of what I've been doing. Specifically in the arts, I've been on the board of the Théâtre du Nouveau Monde. It's one of the institutional theater in Quebec. I've been there for the last 10 years. Small production companies like Porte-Parole, who did wonderful theater plays that have been shown in Toronto during the Pan Am Games. And like everybody here, tons of small fundraising venues, small committees that were put together to just raise money. And I have the pleasure to be the chair of the Montreal Art Council that has a fantastic staff and a fantastic board with the complex governance that is one of its strengths. So Natalie is here along with Julien, and it's just a pleasure to be able to walk along their path for a while. So that's it.
Excellent. So we have a great brain trust here. These five have all been involved in various ways at the genesis of an idea and brought it to life, which is where we're going to start this afternoon. So I want to tap into their experience and learn as much as we can about how they did it, what succeeded and what failed. But to start with, we have this amazing opportunity to brainstorm about Canada's 150th birthday and to do something impactful. And I want to ask you guys to give us not the idea, but help us provide some context for us about how to think about this opportunity we have. Irfhan, do you want to kick us off? How do we think about this?
I was hoping you'd start here again. I was just starting to think. I think I'm actually involved with an organization called Imagination 150, which is trying to organize all sorts of civil society organizations in celebrating Canada's 150th birthday, which is coming up. And so I think that this is an interesting opportunity for culture specifically to put itself on the stage. Because if you go back to 1967, at least I wasn't there in 1967, but if you look at what has resulted from 1967, the things that at least people like me notice, it's like hockey arenas and other public spaces and these tangible things. And I think it's a challenge for culture, because I don't think we necessarily just want to build buildings. Here's our opportunity, I think, to maybe do something that's intangible, and I think maybe change the conversation around culture for Canada. And so, as we think about brainstorming what it is that we do or what culture does to celebrate Canada's 150th birthday, I'd say, the first is, let's not be Canadian. So let's try and do something that's truly global and not just for ourselves. My analogy here is, a birthday party where just the birthday boy or the birthday girl shows up is not much of a party. And so, Canada can show up, but you'd like the rest of the world to come to our party. So let's do something that truly inspires the world to take notice. And the second thing is maybe answering the question of what is Canada's culture, which is, I think, our biggest opportunity. Because I can tell you what Japanese culture is, or French culture is, or Indian culture is. Well, because of the diaspora that's landed in Canada, we can do all of those things plus the amalgamation of those things, I think. And so maybe this is our chance to do something that's truly global because of who we are, that takes the attention of the world onto our country, on our birthday, and that actually defines something that I actually am confused as to what the definition is.
Je ne suis pas certain que personne connaît la vraie définition de la culture canadienne. Je pense qu'il faut mettre ça au pluriel avec un S à culture et peut-être un S à canadienne aussi. Très important pour 2017 de profiter de cette occasion-là pour montrer justement c'est quoi la richesse, la diversité de la culture canadienne. Quand on regarde dans les pages culturelles, les pages artistiques des médias québécois, souvent on a plus d'informations sur ce qui se passe à New York, ou aux États-Unis que ce qui se passe à Toronto ou à Vancouver. Et je pense que ce n'est pas normal. Et ce serait bien de profiter de l'occasion du 150 du Canada pour exposer davantage autant les Québécois aux initiatives artistiques du reste du Canada que l'inverse. And in regards of timing, I mean, it's going to be a great in Montreal in 2017 because we're going to have two things to celebrate, at least. One being Canada's 150th birthday and Montreal's 375th birthday. So we have Mayor Coder and Madame Gauthier from the city of Montreal that are well committed and very well versed into the arts programs and projects. So we're very enthusiastic about 2017 in Montreal.
I think there's also one way to address that, and the diversity of it is the famous think global, act local. It's probably one of the only ways to really go and make sure that we're not forgetting anyone and that we are pushing through some of the emerging talent, and it's not exclusive of the institution. I think that there's an opportunity to have a lot of those partnerships made. So having the big institutions partner up with emerging artists and foster and give them more visibility and more platform. Having young professionals that are probably able to regroup and use, not duplicate and use, but maybe use existing platforms. One initiative that went through in Montreal and that worked well was to use an organization like Le Conseil des Arts de Montréal and their experts as to, so what's happening? How do we look at various artistic proposition and how can we help sustain that? And having young philanthropists regroup, and not with a ton of money, like $500 per person, but when there are 80 of them, you're getting decent awards and or bursary, or like you're able to make a big difference for them. And instead of leveraging or trying to reorganize by themselves and not knowing exactly where to look, they would knock at the door of an institution that will sort of help look at the mix and prepare the landscape a bit, and then they will be directly involved in the decision process, but in getting paired with the artist afterwards and getting really truly involved. And that makes a huge difference because the commitment then starts with that. There's money attached to it, but there's a relationship that is built, and it's built locally. So if that's duplicated pretty much elsewhere, everywhere in Canada, it's certainly something that could probably allow the variety and the diversity to emerge from the communities.
Just to pick up on that, Jan-Fryderyk, that's an interesting idea of Canada's birthdays coming. If I equate it to a gala fundraising event, you often think, well, how do I avoid this being a one-off event? How do I establish a relationship? How do I shift the lens through which people think about arts and artists and supporting them. Can you guys talk more about, again, in the context of Canada 150, how we would go into this brainstorm thinking beyond a single event in a single year, something with a lasting impact? Oh.
That's a small question, really.
Yeah.
You get the easy one.
Talk about what you had for breakfast this morning instead, if you prefer.
Well, my head's swimming a little bit, as it tends to whenever the diversity conversation comes up. So I think there's a couple of things. Events tend to be ephemeral, right? They hang in the air for a moment and then they're gone. But I think the challenge and the opportunity lies in responding to the diversity question of how do we truly represent Canada's diversity well. And I think the answer lies in that as well, because I think if we do a good job of representing Canadian diversity, there's no way of doing that without undergoing some radical activity of inclusion. And the reason why I say radical is because diversity in many circles tends to mean a celebration of European history and art, and reinforcing a pre-existing white power structure, and then adding on to that some notion of recognition of visible minorities and everybody else that seems to be hanging around. And not to make this political by any means, and nor did I vote for this party, but in hindsight I wish I had. But if you look at the Liberal cabinet announcement, I think that was a moment in which I didn't even realize how cynical I was until the morning that cabinet was announced. Because even in my wildest dreams, for all the work that I do, did I believe that we would ever see a cabinet that would be as diverse and representative of Canada, where there was so much not just equality represented, but so much justice at display for the type of people and the positions that they were elevated to. So I think for Canada's 150th, I think there's a moment for us to grasp at social justice, and through that, attain some level of diversity and inclusion. And I think how you see some legacy come out of that is by forming some connective tissue that doesn't exist right now. So I think if we were to turn to the arts companies that exist in this country and the people that we would typically tap on the shoulders to put together these sorts of celebrations and to participate and produce the events for these celebrations, then I think you're going to get sort of an expected result. But I think if we kind of head into the uncomfortable places, if we try to create connective tissue with the communities, with the cultural forms, with the genres, with the groups that we've got zero contact with, understanding that there will be a legacy and there will be sort of compounding benefits coming out of that work in the years and decades to come, I think that'll be the legacy of it, right? Laying down that groundwork now will ensure that we've got a radical level of diversity and inclusion on display for Canada's 150th, and the fact that we formed those relationships will ensure that sort of connective tissue is our legacy after 2017.
I can just speak from my personal experience as a board member on the Canadian Opera Company. This is a conversation that we are having right now. Diversity on boards is, everybody knows that it's an important thing that we need to do. And so the question we have right now is, how do we actually make it happen? And it really comes down to the individual decisions that you make on a day-to-day basis. Who are the people that you invite to that art form? Who are the people that you engage with that art form? Who are the people that you nominate to be your successor on the board level? I find this to be a very important and optimistic time for our future, because we are having those conversations, and it's not a question of whether diversity is important anymore. It's really a question of how are we going to make it happen, and how quickly can we make it happen. And I can just reinforce that all those small decisions that we make on a daily basis are going to have that compounding effect that you just mentioned. Coming from the investment business, the law of compounding is a very, very powerful principle. And it applies to many, many disciplines. So I'm very optimistic that we're going to be able to make a big impact on this area.
I want to push us a bit further on this diversity point, because I think that there's, and this is to your place of being uncomfortable and maybe resetting the conversation, and this is just sort of struck me as I'm looking out at the crowd and looking at us, but one of the big things that I think we need to recognize as a country, especially on a birthday like our 150th, is everything hasn't always been rosy. And when I think about that, I think about the First Nations issue. And I look through this crowd and who's here and who's invited to the conversation and who's part of this, and that's critical. And I do think that, especially with the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission coming out, and especially thinking through the issue of how do you change the conversation, how do you hit the reset and think about what you would have your Canada be, and the Canada that I would aspire to have would be one that would have probably partly some different history of our last 150th year or 150 years. So how do we do also some reparation and change the conversation as part of that? And to me, the number one conversation is on the First Nations front.
Any other themes? Diversity is clearly a huge one. We heard this morning an amazing panel of artists on the gaps in the system right now. As we, again, start to think about solutions to address some of these unmet needs. Anything else you guys want to add in terms of gaps you see, maybe are obvious, maybe some less obvious, that we need to think about in terms of how artists are supported in arts institutions in Canada, from your own experiences?
We're all going to say something here.
Maybe not directly to a gap, but I see a bit of a problem with the framing of support for artists. And I might be alone in this, but I'm just going to throw it out for the sake of being provocative and see what happens. And it has to do with the term philanthropy. And this is something that we've been kind of working with for a while. But when asked, I like to purposely say that I am dead set absolutely against philanthropy. And when asked why, I say it's because of the virtue that's implied in that activity, right? Philanthropy, like the etymology of the word, means love of mankind. But I feel that support for the arts and support for these cultural institutions shouldn't be this elevated virtuous activity, because there's an appeal in that framing, but there's also a flaw in that framing. And I think that's the flaw that we've been kind of dealing with. And I sometimes equate it to the act of like recycling. There was a time when culturally, recycling was for tree huggers. It was this weird extreme activity, right? And for, this is a room filled with the initiated, but for many, many people and for the public at large, philanthropy and supporting the arts is this virtuous extreme activity. They're like, yeah, when I'm rich, then maybe I'll cut a check and that'll be my time to support the arts. And what we need to do is we need to deconstruct that, and we need to make it every day. And that conversation, that framing has to change so that supporting the arts isn't this virtuous extreme thing you're doing. It's a part of the everyday. How do we work it into the tapestry of normal life for the average person?
Anyone else want to add to that?
I would agree with that comment. I think it's really important to normalize this idea of philanthropy and take it away from that idea that it's something only for the elite and for some people who have a very significant amount of wealth. The most important learning that I've had from my experience in the arts as a young professional is that even though I don't have a lot of money, I am able to make a very big impact. And sometimes it's not the money that is making the impact, it's the energy and the ideas and the passion and the ability to create a community around an art form. And so philanthropy, I think for me, is a much bigger, we have to create a much bigger definition. It's not really about a financial investment, it's about an investment of energy and other resources that you can bring to the table. And how can you make them more systematic, and how can you implement them on a very regular basis? That's where you make the longer term impact, because that's when you're changing an organization for the future.
Here's a bit of a leading question for you guys. It's an interesting time in the business world where, you may have heard this, the world's largest taxi company owns no vehicles, the world's most popular offer of rooms owns no real estate. Airbnb, the world's largest retailer, Alibaba keeps no inventory. That's the business world. If for just a minute we didn't consider our extraordinary new Minister of Heritage, and if for a minute we didn't think about our deeply valued and wonderful, well-established arts organizations, and we thought about what this group could do, what we could do to support artists, perhaps in a more direct fashion. Mo, I'm not sure if this is closer to what you're talking about every day, but is that business and this is something different, or is there anything there to help us think about ways in which we might deliver a more direct result to support the arts community?
Was that one question? Well, I'll start responding maybe by looking at what is either saturated or working, but for how long, and how we might need to rethink and get involved in reshaping what that means. One of the main issues right now, and it's certainly true for a smaller organization, and it is for institution, is the ways that we are doing fundraising and funding. And often enough, we're beside the core activities. We're asking a theater company to put together an event, a gala, black tie, whatever it is, have an added value proposition for that evening so that you're having a distinct appeal to it because there's 3 other evenings that night. With the business community that is what it is, and like the Montreal business community is big. It's certainly smaller than Toronto, but at some point everybody's getting the same letters and are asking to cut a check, and at some point have to decide what are the causes that they're supporting. And we're beside the core business. So if it's hard for an institution to cope with that, and they might be successful in raising $1 million during that venue, how does a small company that has a resource and a half, or 3 resources, luckily full-time, but most likely part-time, are going to be able to put that together? So yes, volunteers and people are going to come, but it's a lot of noise, and you're not going to see a play that evening. You're going to put together an event to get money out of it so that you're actually able to go back to your creative process and do something. So I think that one of the ways we have to rethink how we're approaching this as business professionals and as entrepreneur and cultural entrepreneur is how can we go closer to the core. I hate to say core business, but you know what I mean, the core business of that art organization, and not depart from it and get some funding for your core issues in your creative process. And does that mean finding new ways to distribute or give access to what you've put out? I mean, you're putting together a play so that people are coming and seeing it. If you're doing it only for 5 nights, like recoupment point is not even in sight. Hence, all the other funding efforts that are needed. But what if that could be duplicated? What if there could be, we were talking about technology earlier on, but other ways to participate in that distribution, whether it's through the virage numérique, whether it's through streaming, whether it's like we have to populate the access, raise the awareness, and make sure that we're very active in getting all these gems out and put as much dollars and value in the core and not in special project or things that would divert from the creative process that they are trying to achieve.
And there's some new applications.
It sounds better in French.
There's some new applications that can be useful in that matter to help small artistic companies like Kickstarter or Patreon. I don't know if I'm mispronouncing it. That are quite useful and that kind of democratize the art of founding, if we can put it that way. Et ces applications-là permettent en fait de renverser le rapport de force qu'on a souvent entre les grandes organisations qui financent le milieu artistique. Il y a un rapport de force que moi j'aime pas toujours, qu'on observe à l'occasion, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a comme une espèce de regard qui est pas, mon Dieu, even in French I can talk, qui permet pas en fait de parler d'égal à égal, et des entreprises comme Kickstarter et Patreon permettent justement de démocratiser, un peu comme on a vu dans le milieu politique avec la campagne de Barack Obama ou même de Justin Trudeau, où on a rendu les petits dons facilement accessibles et facilement possibles pour l'ensemble de la population. Alors c'est quelque chose qu'on devrait faire aussi dans le milieu des arts, selon moi.
I think what both Charles and Jan-Fryderyk are talking about ties to what you were talking about with Uber and Airbnb, and that these are new ways of business, new business models, and they're scalable. I think underlying both of these things, though, is a mindset shift. So people just thought completely differently about what was even possible. And I think that as a group of individuals that support arts and culture in Canada, we owe ourselves also a mindset shift. And I'll give you just two examples of that. The first is, in the last couple of weeks, I've heard a number of times, including here today, how excited we are that the Canada Council funding has been doubled. And we think that's fantastic news. And I think we let the federal government get away with just doubling it, because we know through the data from Business for the Arts that for every dollar that we invest in the arts, we get $11 of GDP. And $11 of GDP, we also know through economic theory, generates $4 to $5 of tax revenue. And so if you put in $1 as the government, you take out 4, we just celebrated the fact that the government did that just once. If I gave you the opportunity to buy a share that you knew was worth $10 for $2, and you said, well, I'll take one of those, not 10 of them or 20 of them or 50 of them until it actually was worth $10, you'd think that's crazy. But we just celebrated what I would argue is a completely asinine outcome. That's just, it doesn't make sense. And why did we let them do that? It's because we put ourselves in this place of saying that we're going to beg for this cash and we're a cost. We're not a cost. This isn't something that's an economic burden to the country or the economy. This is an investment, and not an and we always talk about it being an investment and there's a social good. It makes us feel good. It's part of who we are as humans. That's all true. I'm not going to take any of that away, but it's also the best economic investment we can make as a country. But we keep forgetting that. And when things like this happen today, we don't bring it up again. So I think we owe ourselves a massive mindset shift. And I'll give you a second story. I'm working on this thing in Blythe, which is a theater festival. And there's one restaurant in Blythe, which is a fantastic restaurant. It could be in Manhattan. The chef is amazing. He charges like $14 for his dinners. I can't understand that. It doesn't make sense, but I take part in it and I try and tip them well to feel better about myself. And I promise you that the Blythe Festival goes across the street to this restaurant called the Part 2 Bistro and says, you get customers because we exist, so you need to contribute to the Blythe Festival in our theater show. And they probably do, but instead he should be saying, well, people come here and they go to the show because there's a restaurant to eat at. There's a symbiotic relationship there. It's true social enterprise, and it goes both ways. And I think we need to change the mindset to say, okay, this is actually an economic investment that goes both ways, and how do we force ourselves to continue to think about that versus just putting ourselves back into the we're a cost and we're part of the leech of society versus something that actually grows it probably better than any other investment that can happen. Or give me another 4 to 1 if you have one.
Yeah, but because it's framed in that supporting the arts, there's still some philanthropic baggage there, so we're supposed to just take it because it's a virtuous activity.
Which is nice, but that's not all of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple things, I guess. There's investment and then there's the model. So the investment is great, but our model doesn't really work right now. And I can't tell you how many people I've actually talked out of forming not-for-profit societies in BC. And these are good people trying to do interesting things, and they've been excited and they've been, wanting to get going, and I've utterly talked them out of registering a not-for-profit society. We just do not need another not-for-profit society. We had an arts summit in Vancouver, I want to say like 2 years ago, and it was actually in a room like this that we discovered we had something like 180 theater companies within like a 20-mile radius. And it was just because you had all of these people running and working in their own silos that were looking for access, trying to figure out how to do things. And the only avenues they were given because of the pre-existing models was to incorporate a not-for-profit society. But that makes absolutely no sense when you're an artist and you're there for the art and you're there for the craft. And all you want to do is get going with the work that you want to do, as opposed to having a minimum of 3 directors on your board and an AGM, and you're filing minutes, and there's all this baggage that comes with the administrivia. So this is one of those instances where policy actually has the potential to lead culture. And if we were able to take inspiration from the Ubers, Airbnbs, and the Facebooks, and say, we actually want to unlock all this creative and artistic capacity we have by doing away with these completely, ancient models of incorporation in these societies and everything that comes with them, and provide artists and even arts collectives and cultural groups with some way to undertake the work and get access from both government and private funding, but not have to take on the sort of bureaucratic burden of it all. Then we can actually unlock this capacity. But that doesn't exist right now.
Well, it does. But I think it's just barely starting, and by all means not in the magnitude that it should. But at the municipal level, the Art Council in Montreal has opened up to collectives for that very reason, because you're spot on. It's like it's an issue that was created, or a beast that was created by those are institutions to some extent, and you have to be organized, you have to have a governance of some sort, and you have to be incorporated or registered in such a way so that you're going to get funds. And I mean, corporations, we're looking at them the same way. Now, by opening the doors so that collectives are now eligible, not saying you're opening the floodgates, but it's something that has to be, duplicated and magnified. I think one thing we've touched on was the economic impact, and that we're starting to talk or argue about whether or not it was enough, or what are we going to do with it. And at least there is now a real discussion about the investment, and not just saying it's a cost, and what it brings back to a community and how essential it is. And even when you look at the numbers, we were talking about the numbers this morning, and the number of employees or jobs that creates in Montreal, and the impact on the GDP. But one thing we're not talking nearly enough is the social impact, and how we should be starting to quantify that, or to reactualize some of the studies that are there, mainly with the kids, for example, where you're looking at some of the stats that got out with the dropout rate that is so much higher in some of the studies we've consulted for kids that have not had the chance to have access to art at a young age, and it was just melting like snow under the sun for the ones who had the chance to be brought to any form of art as young. And then when you start to explore those stats, it's true for the dropout rate, but then it carries on, because it's true as well for how they are going to be involved in their community and their access to some professional jobs. And it's something that we're just merely touching, and it can go a long way in getting that discussion forward with numbers that people are not going to be shy or will turn away from, but that will just be proud and will say, well, we need more of that, and then maybe get even more money out of it. So.
I was reminded when you were talking, Mo, about the bureaucracy of it on the artist panel this morning, in answer to the question of if you could change something in the last 5 years, what would it be? And Shannon said resources more quickly. She didn't say more, although I'm sure more is better, but more quickly. There's something very interesting there as well. So we may come up with the most incredible idea this afternoon, but of course it won't go anywhere unless this group is able to galvanize people around it, to get a group excited about it. You five have done this before. This is a leadership question. What is your advice for this group on how to take the germ of an idea and rally people around it, ultimately, hopefully rally an entire country around it?
I'm going to take a shot because I don't want to go last, because average idea right now wins. So when we talk about resources, we talk about both people and money, right? That's what you're actually asking. So how does it work? And I think it's, if you make something big and bold, the resources will find it. I mean, so if you dream average, it's going to struggle and sputter along. But if you dream really big, really bold, people want to be involved with things that are exciting. And if you have something that's big and bold and it's attracting people, it will attract the financial resources behind it as well. So I think our challenge is not to think too small, because that A, doesn't have an impact because it's not a big enough idea, and B, it won't get resourced.
I think Mr. Molson said the best line to me today a few minutes ago. He said, know your content. So if you want to be a good promoter of an artistic organization you believe in, you have to know what it's all about, why it exists, what's its qualities, what's its faults, flaws. Personally, I've been a festival goer of Festival TransAmériques 10 years before I got involved in it. So when I came on board, I knew what was missing, what was the opportunities that we should have taken prior. I mean, I'm not succeeding in all of it, but I at least I know. I kind of feel like I know what I'm talking about. So I think that's a key factor of success for that.
I would say one very important thing is oftentimes to do something that has a massive impact, you oftentimes have to empower a committee. And one of the questions about how to do that, or one thing that I learned very quickly, is that it's very important to give people on a committee accountability for what their role in that project is. I learned this myself as co-chair of Operation. I was responsible for sponsorship for the event. And I agreed to take on this role, and I didn't really think about it. I thought, oh, this will be a fun party. And then when I realized that I was in charge of sponsorship and that no money would come in unless I did anything, it was a very important realization for me. But it actually empowered me to be creative and to figure out how to solve the problem. And so one of the things that I think is very important when you're leading a committee is to look around the table and see what different capabilities each person is able to bring to that table, and then empower them and give them ownership over it, and you'll be amazed what people can do.
Well, we talked about ambition, so I guess that aiming for the stars and worst case landing on the moon is a decent proposal, but you do need a viable means of transportation. So there's a matter of being realistic in how you can approach something that is ambitious so that you can actually land somewhere. That's one. Two, not thinking that it can be done with only one pilot. It's going to be done with a team, and that's probably the way to get closer to know what your topic is, because you'll have so many issues and ideas that needs to be it needs to be a collective effort. So to me, it's getting people on board, and people on board that will be complementary and that will focus with what they know best towards something that they might not know as well as they would want to, but that they are interested in. I think that's the recipe that will probably give you at least the ingredients needed, and then let's see how it plays in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I think I'm echoing most of what's been said. I think in the business world, we call them big, hairy, audacious goals. I think it's one thing to rally people around a project, and a totally other thing to rally people around a movement. But the one thing I want to return to is just the diversity notion again, because I think over time we started hearing that it's just kind of assumed that diversity is a good thing, and we understand diversity and we should try for more diversity. But I'm not sure if we've actually ever attained a real solid business case yet, or clarity around why diversity is important. And maybe I want to frame that for this group before we go into the brainstorming. So diversity isn't just about representation. Imagine you're a cell phone company and you're going to position satellites to create the largest coverage area. When you place those satellites close together, you have a low coverage area. When you place them far apart, you have a very large swath of land that you can cover. That large swath of land is where innovation takes place. Diversity's primary driver and its primary purpose is to place opinions and worldviews at a distance from each other so that there is a massive space in between them, and that's where innovation takes place. So if you're going to start out with a group to generate new ideas and generate new innovations, then make sure it's a diverse group at the outset, because that's one way to guarantee that some innovation will actually happen.
I want to make sure you guys have an opportunity to ask some questions of these interesting guys. Does anyone have a question? Yes, right there. Just wait for a mic. It's coming. He's right there.
Hi. A couple of times today, people have mentioned the obsolescence of the nonprofit organization as being needlessly heavy and not conducive to the concentrating on the actual creation of artwork. And I think it's a really interesting observation, and it's great to see that some councils, such as the CAM, are starting to open up to collectives. As far as the philanthropy side, I imagine that people in the room must be familiar with shared charitable platforms that are beginning to crop up on a pilot basis. I'm thinking specifically of the pilot project that's happening with the Metcalf Foundation in partnership with 4 arts councils in Toronto and Ontario, plus the Canada Council. And is this something that is going to be helpful in terms of getting capacity to organization or to collectives, to artistic ventures and groups that are not necessarily so formalized?
I guess we'll see. I'm hopeful that those. I think that any initiatives that is basing itself, I think, on existing foundations to build something up has more chances right now of tapping into the areas of expertise that we were highlighting earlier, and the capital or funds or new ways of spending funds than if we are starting from scratch with a duplicated structure. And that's something that used to happen, or that is often enough still happening, and someone has a great idea that has a lot of merit and wants to get something together and put it through, but then it's yet another structure instead of having a rally, like you were saying, of not so much behind the structure or the model, but getting a collective opinion as to how things should be done. And then if there are existing vehicles that are doing part of that job and they need to be reoriented and need to welcome new proposals or need to welcome collectives, well, then those models have to adapt, but the know-how is already there. There's so many knowledgeable staff that is already there that you can turn these boats around, but they need to be properly influenced, and they need to hear the lack or the problems that past situations have created, so that those are addressed. But yes, I'm quite hopeful that these types of platforms will address some of the issues that are not resolved or haven't been resolved yet for some of these actors.
Any other questions? Yes, right over here.
Just a brief comment. Someone made the statement earlier that we hope that if we throw the party, other people will come. And I just wanted to mention that in 2017, and it's May, I think, maybe late May, early June, Montreal will be hosting the International Society for the Performing Arts, their annual Congress. I'm on the board, and one of the reasons we chose Montreal as the place to gather between 300 and 400 of the world's arts leaders was because of both the diversity of the country and also because it was an anniversary both for the city of Montreal and for Canada. And I think what was also interesting was that whole discussion around the idea of really embedding that whole philosophy of philanthropy. So it's not an act that's rarefied, but rather something that's embedded in the way that people think. And what's been interesting in being part of that board is that the membership on the board level are from people from all around the world who have very different ideas of what giving is. And for some people, there's actually no tradition of giving. But the idea being that if we as a board can bring together 100% giving, whether it's somebody giving $5 and another person giving $10,000, it represents that we're all invested in the same thing. And I think that if we can sort of relay that as a philosophy of giving in Canada, where everybody can participate on some level and it's still meaningful, then we can sort of change that whole idea and reframe it in the way that you spoke about. But I think those things are really important, and thanks for saying that.
Thank you for that. We have time for one more question. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Stephanie Bertion. I co-chair the board of the Young Professionals for the McCord Museum here in Montreal. It's our social history museum. maybe just a success story I'd like to share with you guys. We see a lot of familiar faces here in the room, but for people that are outside of Montreal, you may not be aware of this, but the Young McCord Council this year, we launched our first crowdfunding campaign to bring one class at the McCord from a disadvantaged community for 1 week. And it was very successful because, yes, we had that social aspect that was extremely strong, and we also had the magic of small gifts, so $5, $10, and it drew a lot of attention, and people got really engaged, and we actually successfully completed our crowdfunding campaign with 2 weeks at the McCord rather than 1. So basically 2 classes are going to be able to come, and people from the business community were so impressed that we had 2 matching gifts as well. So things like that are small initiatives, could really have a snowball effect. So I thought it would be useful to share with everyone.
Thank you for sharing that. So everyone, we're thinking about a global opportunity. We are thinking about how we can make those connections not once or twice a year with the arts and artists, but every day. We want the issue of diversity to be represented and solved, and we have a huge opportunity ahead of us. Good luck. Please join me in thanking this incredible panel.